Well, thank you very much. It really is a great pleasure to be here with all of you, and thanks to all of you for being here. I know that it is not for me, though. I know it's actually to watch Greg Vogel to see how well he does masquerading as a professor. His new cover. He's actually still a member of the National Clandestine Service, but this is his new gig. And I should, of course, since this is a school from Texas, I should say it's great to be with all you all, not just you all, as they taught me before. I've done events down there in the past. It's a real privilege, actually, to do something for the school that bears the name of Bush 41. I actually knew him quite well. I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army during the two big wars that he oversaw. There was a lot of interaction with him. We hadn't had Gold War Nichols yet. There was no vice chairman, so the chiefs had a lot more time with him. And then subsequent to that, for example, I was on the drop zone when he actually did that 70th anniversary free fall. And that was a real free fall. That was not a tandem. The 80th was a tandem. And I remember being right there when he landed, and he was a bit white. And I asked the guys that were jumping with him, because he did have a couple of golden knights that were supposed to stabilize him, get him flat, let go for the photo op, get their hands on him again, and then pull the parachute. And it didn't go that way. He actually, he tumbled for a good 3,000 or 4,000 feet. That does things to your eyes and so forth. In any event, he did make it. He had a radio on him, but that was a no kidding free fall. And think about doing that actually at my age, and it gives you yet another standard against which to measure yourself. Been to the Bush School down there a number of occasions, including when our great diplomatic partner, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, was the dean, and even gave the commencement down there. By the way, I do want to note, Chief, that I did outrun the Rudders Rangers, I think they're called down there. I was as the CENTCOM commander, I was, modestly proud of that particular accomplishment. Look, the chief and I go way back, and he will always be chief to me, not DO, because there I was, a two-star General, Eagle 6, the commander of the 801st Airborne Division during the fight to Baghdad, the first big battle of that war, the city of Najaf. And some guy in a pickup truck pulls up. I mean, we're on Kevlars. There's attack helicopters hammering overhead. There's close air support up there. There's artillery. There's infantrymen. We can see all of this happening. It's sort of approaching the penultimate moment in that particular fight. All three brigades converging on a city of 500,000. And up pulls this pickup truck with a guy with a baseball cap on backwards. And I always tease him that I can never remember if it was Alabama or Auburn.
Come on, sir.
And he's sitting in the back of this pickup truck behind a massive air defense artillery piece. And he says, "Hey, Eagle 6, how are you doing? How's it going?" And I said, "Oh, you must be that expert that they said that they were going to send."
I'm your man, sir.
And we have been ever since. How much can I say about your past and how many times we interacted?
So this is about you tonight.
Okay. Well, let me just say that, over the next 12 years, really, because all we did was fight for that moment on, and really until the end time that I was the director of the CIA, we were in the war zones repeatedly, in multiple chiefs of station positions, including at one point where I was the 4-star. So I was commanded Afghanistan, actually, after Central Command. He was a mainstay in the surge with JSOC. Folks don't realize that. And then there were some other positions over the years, including one where I by-named him to a horrible country that needed his help, and he provided it. So really great to be on stage with you. I thought I would start tonight by talking about a topic that Bush 41 exemplified, which was strategic leadership. And the reason I think this is important, especially for the students, is because the intellectual construct that I'm going to lay out for this, I think will also apply throughout the rest of our conversation this evening. But it's really wonderful to keep in mind as you are either working for a strategic leader or for a significant leader, or you are a leader or ultimately a strategic leader yourself. There are 4 tasks of a strategic leader. And if you think about this, George H.W. Bush performed these incredibly well, especially, frankly, when it came to Panama and then Desert Shield and Desert Storm. The first of these is you've got to get the big ideas right, the overarching strategic ideas. If you think of the surge in Iraq, which I was privileged to command, the biggest of the big ideas was 180 degrees different from what it was we were doing when the surge began. That's change leadership. It doesn't get any more change than 180 degrees. Think about George H.W. Bush. They convened the first national security meeting after the invasion of Kuwait. The military, as Bob Woodward recounts, wasn't sure they really wanted to do this. General Powell was actually a bit skittish about it. Bush arrives and he says, "This will not stand." Okay, that's a pretty good big idea. We can take and run with that. That is the essence of strategic leadership when it comes to getting the big ideas right. And there were many, many more. Second, you have to communicate the big ideas effectively. Think of the incredible work they did under his leadership, with him at the helm, gathering a coalition, getting UN Security Council resolutions, getting the entire world behind them. I mean, incredibly unlikely partners all there together. Some that are literally adversaries, except that they're all part of this coalition that the US is leading. And again, the communication, absolutely extraordinary. And then you have overseen the implementation of the big ideas, and his hand on the helm again was incredibly steady. Lots of drama, I can tell you, having been the exec or the assistant exec and the aide to the chief for that entire period, and watching as the drama between the chiefs and General Schwarzkopf, the drama between various coalition partners, the drama, remember, with Israel about if you get hit by a Scud, you can't shoot back. We're going to do everything we can to take the Scuds down, and all the rest of this. And again, many, many other examples. By the way, this is what we normally think of as leadership, this particular task, overseeing the implementation. This is the example you provide, the inspiration, the energy, the hiring the great people, attracting them, keeping them fired up, developing them, allowing some others to move on more quickly than they might have thought. How do you spend your time, your battle rhythm? It's the metrics that tell you whether you're winning or losing. All of this is hugely important. And then there's a fourth task that you've constantly got to remember and have on your battle rhythm, so it forces you to perform it. And that is that you have to refine the big ideas. You have to determine what is necessary that you have to change so that you can do the whole process again and again and again. Think of Kodak, by the way, in this regard, the leader in film photography. They had over 2,000 patents on digital photography, but they failed to make that the new big idea for their firm. They got beat to it by others, and they never recovered. They're still trying to reinvent themselves, still trying to get a new big idea that could galvanize that firm once again. I can give you examples of this throughout the civilian world. I've been privileged, again, as was noted, to be a partner in an investment firm for nearly a decade now. We have managed over $500 billion, own 120 companies with minority interest in another 100. We see this on display all the time. I'm actually a personal venture capitalist, invested in over 25 countries because I love the excitement of young founders and leaders and seeing if they can scale a big idea. You can even look at Netflix, which is a wonderful example, because I think Reed Hastings is a tremendous strategic leader, unerring in getting the big ideas right, communicating them, overseeing their implementation, and determining how to refine them and reinvent that firm. First big idea for Netflix, remember, we're going to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar. We're going to put Blockbuster out of business. At least we're going to undercut them. 2 years later, they go through all this. He does it all brilliantly. They sit down here. He has his action forcing mechanism to make sure he's forced to make decisions about how to refine the big ideas. He says, how are we doing? Well, we're doing great. Blockbuster's going out of business. And some of you will know that there is one Blockbuster left. It's in a famously contrarian town, Big Bend, Oregon, which so embraces its Blockbuster that it will not let it fail. And now it's become a tourist attraction for all the people who are nostalgic about the days when you could rent a movie at brick and mortar, and it's doing better than ever. But in any event, so the next big idea, broadband speeds now are fast enough so that you can have people download movies. And that's the new big idea. They communicate it, internally, externally, stakeholders, customers, everything. Then he oversees the implementation of that. Okay, that's going great. But of course, a couple of years and there's competitors crowding into that. So what's the new big idea? Create our own content. $100 billion just on, or $100 million just on House of Cards alone. And then many, many other, of course, iconic series that they create that we all revisited during the binge days of COVID and so forth. Again, brilliant stuff. And then the fourth big idea, he decides we're going to make major motion pictures. We're going to go out and buy a couple of movie studios, lock, stock, and barrel. And they do that so successfully that 3 years ago, they had more Academy Award nominations than any other major motion picture studio. So just again, unerring in what it is they've done. Now, I will note to you, Greg, that I did actually sit down with Reed. I've actually talked about this construct with him. By the way, it's actually, we captured this, it's distilled at the Belfer Center at Harvard, where I was a fellow for 6 years, as a team of folks that worked for me in Iraq and Afghanistan that wanted to do that. So you can find it at belfercenter.org. But I sat down with Reed and I said, you know, all this stuff was just flawless with one exception. And that was that movie about our mutual combat comrade and very close friend, Stan McChrystal, in which Brad Pitt played Stan McChrystal, who has a sense of humor. He's not a wooden soldier the way Brad Pitt made him turn out. It was just, and I said, this has to have been Brad Pitt's worst role ever. Besides, I just can't believe that Brad Pitt did not play me. Anyway, I thought it might be useful to start with that. And again, there's plenty of examples, again, from The Surge or from other episodes that I was privileged, positions I was privileged to hold, where this construct becomes crucial. And you should constantly be asking yourself whether you have the big ideas right. Have you communicated them effectively throughout the breadth and depth of the organization, and also up and out and all the other stakeholders? How are you doing in the oversight of the implementation? And then are you formally forcing yourself to sit down and determine how they need to be refined? And again, with action forcing mechanisms that require you to sit with the lessons learned teams or the commanders that you're privileged to lead, or your own planners or whatever it may be, so that you are continually performing this particular set of tasks, which is the essence of strategic leadership. And then just finally, I'd point out that, yes, strategic leaders are the ones at the very top. It's the director of the CIA, it's the director of NSA, but all other leaders do perform these 4 tasks. The difference is that you're doing it within the confines or the constraints or the intent that has been expressed by the individual at the very top. So, you know, when I was privileged to be, say, a brigade or battalion or division commander, you know, there's somebody above me. I wasn't the strategic leader, but depending on how much latitude in there, you've still got to get those big ideas right. And so this construct, I think, is actually pretty useful as a guide, again, as an intellectual mechanism for figuring out how it is you should perform your duties.
Yes, sir. And just as a sidebar, sir, when Netflix does decide to do your story,
I want you playing me.
I'm asking Danny DeVito to play me. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to throw a few.
By the way, thank you for wearing a tie today. I know
Yes,
that
sir.
you have to return it to the.
It's got to get back to Walmart by 2100. So we've got to hurry up, sir. I'm going to throw a couple at you,
Sure,
sir, and I know
you
you're
bet.
going to run with it.
Yep.
So
Okay.
Above the fold, we see China, we see the
Yep.
Ukraine.
Yep.
Let's start with Ukraine. So take it.
Sure. Let me actually set an overall arching context, because I think it's probably worth doing that, because I think here it's useful to think of the United States and the situation that we face, which I think is the greatest number and greatest complexity of challenges since the end of World War II, not even just since the end of the Cold War. Now, it may not be as dangerous as some decades or episodes in the Cold War, but more complex for sure. And if you think of us as the guy in the circus who has to keep a whole tent full of plates spinning on sticks, albeit with individuals to help us do that in the form of allies and partners if we treat them well, Nonetheless, that number of plates and what they represent is more challenging, I think, again, than anything since the end of World War II. And you noted there's China's, that's the biggest plate in the tent, probably bigger than all the others. We can't let it even wobble. We do have lots of allies and partners to help us with that one. There's the Russia plate. We'll talk about Ukraine in a second. That's gotten bigger and more menacing. Still North Korea, still Iran, maybe even a couple of Iranian plates, the nuclear programs, support to militias, the precision munitions, drones, and so forth. There are individual plates still representing the remnants of the Islamist extremists that we didn't finish off back in the day, or that others gave up following as intently in some cases as we might have. And so you still have to keep pressure and an eye on them. There are cyber threats that have multiplied in a variety of different ways of all forms, nation state, criminals, extremist groups, and so forth. There's even, domestic, for us, there would be internal threats. In fact, the domestic extremist threat has grown very substantially. But when you look at this, that's the context in which we are, I think, doing a very impressive job supporting Ukraine, and again, leading a coalition of nations. Yes, there's some decisions that I'd like to have seen be a bit more rapid. The delay in the decision on the M1 tanks was a bit concerning. I'd like to see ATACMS. There's a few others, more advanced drones, but by and large, I mean, $32 billion worth of arms, ammunition, and other assistance. Keeping in mind that it's a lot easier to sit up here where the two of us are sitting than where we used to sit, around a table, especially the one in the West Wing of the White House, where that responsibility really weighs on your shoulders pretty heavily. So in the case of Ukraine, I think, again, the U.S. and Western response has been really quite extraordinary. Now, I was at the Munich Security Conference last year, a few days before the invasion began, and I felt a sense of unity there that I hadn't felt since I was a speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander back during the Cold War days. Nothing like it since then. And of course, the irony of this is that in setting out to make Russia great again, what Putin has really done is make NATO great again, even adding 2 new members, one of which is certain to come in very shortly now, Finland, and the other will over time, I think, Sweden as well. And it has galvanized certain countries. What Germany has done, this is whatever the name is for a lightning bolt that they have in German, quite an extraordinary development there. Among a number of others as well. Where are we now in Ukraine? We are temporarily in a bit of a stalemate. The director of analysis can grade my work here in a moment. But essentially, Russia has been throwing soldiers, not very skillfully, not achieving combined arms effects, at Bakhmut and a couple of other locations in the southeastern part of the country, almost encircling 2 of these. But not quite, and Ukraine forcing them to bleed very, very heavily for them. It may be that Russia ultimately is able to own Bakhmut and perhaps the other location that's embattled. If they do, they will have paid an incredible price for communities that are completely destroyed. Now, President Zelensky is determined not to let them have it if he can. He sees the symbolic importance of this. He's spoken about that just in the last 48 hours or so. But what we really need to watch is not what's happening on the battlefield right now. It's what's happening at training centers that U.S. runs in Germany, Grafenwehr-Hohenfels, UK, Poland, Ukraine itself, where entire new brigades are being established, largely with new recruits from Ukraine, but also with some seasoned commissioned and non-commissioned officers. Over time, will be equipped with Western tanks or with the residual Soviet bloc systems, Western infantry fighting vehicles, Western wheeled armored vehicles, really quite an extraordinary array of systems. And this late May, early June, there is going to be a heck of an offensive from the Ukrainians, very likely in the south. It probably has to be roughly the Melitopol area. And they will try to sever the ground line of communications that Russia has established along the southeast coast of Ukraine, linking into Crimea. I believe that they are going to achieve, for the first time in this war, true combined arms effects, because they will, for the first time, Russians have not at all done this. They've failed from day one. They have sent tanks just right down the road without infantry. The Ukrainians will have tanks with infantry and infantry fighting vehicles, keeping the enemy's infantry and their anti-tank guided missiles off those tanks. They will have engineers and EOD to reduce obstacles and defuse explosives and mines. They will have air defense to keep the Russian air off them. They'll have electronic warfare to jam the Russians' networks. They'll have artillery and mortars to suppress the enemy forces. They'll have good command and control. They'll have logistics pushed right up behind them with additional arms, ammunition, or arms, fuel, water, food, medical support. And they'll have reserve forces, which they did not have in the offensive in the Kharkiv area last fall. That was very impressive, but basically ran out of steam because human beings can only go for about 72 hours-ish before they just physically no longer have any capacity to do much on the battlefield. We reached that point, by the way. We proved this during the fight to Baghdad a couple of different times. I believe that's what's going to happen. And the question then, and we might actually ask the DA privately later, the question then is, can Putin over time be convinced that he will not be able to outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans, which is what he currently thinks. He thinks that, again, Russians, just like they did to Napoleon's army and the Nazis, that they're going to prevail over time because they have more fortitude. And or could this war be made unsustainable for the Russians because of the sheer extraordinary casualties? Keep in mind that in the first year of this war, the Russians lost perhaps as much as 5 times the soldiers in a single year that the Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan in a decade. When does this become unsustainable? When is the damage on the battlefield and on the home front due to the financial, economic, and personal sanctions and export controls and the loss of now probably 1 million or more Russian citizens, 500,000 of them, their best and brightest, who left early on, and others that are leaving rather than go to the conscript stations? When does this become unsustainable? The truth is, it's an unanswerable question, and I think even the great director of analysis for a number of years probably couldn't do this with high confidence, answer this. But that's sort of where we are, of course, after a year that saw Russia lose the Battle of Kyiv, lose the Battle of Sumy and Chernihiv, lose the Battle of Kharkiv, lose the Battle of Kherson, and lose everybody who was east of the Dnipro River. And again, take staggering losses and lose well over half of their entire tank fleet, to the point that they are now pulling out of mothballs T-55 tanks, which are basically a World War II era tank. I mean, they're getting desperate and they can't get the replacements for that, at least, although they are able, unfortunately, to get drones from Iran that have proved to be quite damaging. So the question, I think, the central question is, can the U.S. continue to lead this effort? I believe we can, in a way that keeps Congress with us. I think we can, despite certain elements of the Republicans in the House being opposed to this. Keep the rest of NATO with them. I think we can, and the rest of the West, noting that there's some pretty substantial groups in the South, if you will,
right,
that are not with this. And that's I was just in India for a week with the Trilateral Commission, and made keenly aware by them in particular, that of course many other countries are sitting this out basically, and or taking advantage of reduced rates for natural gas, crude oil, minerals, and so forth from Russia. But that's where we stand. And I think, again, I should point out, I am truly non-political. I don't even register to vote. I stopped when I was promoted to 2 stars and never resumed. I advise members of either party if they're responsible. I was very critical of this administration for withdrawing from Afghanistan, which I thought there were alternatives. I felt it was going to be a disastrous outcome, and I believe that, sadly, that has been validated. But I think in this case, the administration deserves actually quite high marks for what it is that they've guided around the world as well as from here. And for those that are in this room that are engaged in this, again, my compliments to you, because it is really quite extraordinary. I think clearly one of the many miscalculations that Putin made, and there were many, was the way that the U.S. has responded. And then if I just end by coming back to that tent full of plates, let's always remember that what happens in one part of the world reverberates in others. And after the Afghan withdrawal and the way it was conducted, President Xi said, look, you can't depend on the Americans. They're not a reliable ally or partner. And oh, by the way, look how it went. They're a great power in decline. This is pushing that in the rearview mirror and showing the U.S. once again, I think, as the indispensable nation. And again, really very impressed by what the administration has done in this regard.
Sir, let me have a quick
Sure.
follow-up, and this is just I think about this question. If it plays out as you predicted it will, and Putin gets in the corner, what do you think the likelihood of deployment of a nuclear tactical weapon would be?
Well, let me look to the DA again while I offer this thought. My sense is that although he has rattled the saber on a number of occasions, most recently now deploying nuclear weapons to Belarus, which really doesn't matter at all. I mean, it's immaterial whether they're in Russian soil or Belarusian soil. That these are to some degree acts of desperation, just trying anything to divide the West, to drive a wedge between Europe and North America or what have you. But that because of the response of the United States, our allies and partners, and perhaps most significantly, President Xi of China and Prime Minister Modi of India, both of whom cautioned him against using nuclear weapons quite firmly, and reportedly in this most recent visit that President Xi had in Moscow as well. And the U.S. National Security Advisor, an understated guy, Jake Sullivan, is a very, very, again, very mild-mannered, brilliant, understated individual who said, you know, what would the result be? Catastrophic consequences. That Putin will not use nuclear weapons because, and again, maybe I should touch wood, of this, the actions of these individuals, and therefore convincing him that Russia would be worse off rather than better off if nuclear weapons are used. There's a bunch of other details, such as, you know, how would you even use them? They can affect your soldiers as well as others. I mean, the wind could blow that way. It's a, you know, again, there's a lot of tactical complexity to this as well. And I actually, you know, a lot of us have tried to game this out, if you will, virtually and so forth. And it's not as easy as it sounds. It's not as impressive as it might, you know, they do a lot of death and destruction, but okay, then what? And so the key is, again, to ensure that deterrence dissuasion remains very, very strong so that this threshold is not crossed. I think that could open up all kinds of challenges if it was.
As you knock on wood, I hope we're dealing with a rational mindset. That's
well, you know, I think, again, if you understand his perspective, his mindset is rational. I mean, you have to understand his set of historical grievances, his conviction that the worst day of the 20th century, as he described it, was not World War I or World War II or the Great Depression. It was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I mean, if you accept that, and then if you accept his revisionist, revanchist view of history, that Ukraine doesn't even have a right to exist, then you can understand his framework, his intellectual foundation on which he's built these decisions. The key is, though, that I think we've got to continue to try to impress on him how bad this would be if he does it. That, you know, if you're in a hole and he is in a hole, stop digging rather than make it deeper. And that's pretty critical.
Yes, sir. I'm going to throw one more at you, sir,
Sure.
and then we're going to open it up to the students because
Great.
that's why we're here.
And the students have to get ready for this. And he'll call on you, by the way. He's an old Marine, you know. If you don't put your hands up.
Start doing push-ups. Sir, switching gears.
Yep.
China.
Yeah. This is getting more in a way worrisome almost daily lately. We'll see what the result is of the visit of the Taiwanese president, who is, quote, transiting the United States, to get to some Central American countries. She's gone through New York. It's an interesting way to transit, but and we'll come back out through Los Angeles, and we'll see if there's a meeting with the speaker and so forth. And again, the concern is that these kind of issues can spiral a bit. And when you have a side that doesn't even answer the phone when the Pentagon actually picks up the hotline and the other end isn't answered, and you're in the middle of a fairly substantial crisis, the balloon incident, and they refuse to do what we did when we made a mistake. You'll recall we bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the air campaign during Kosovo. I happened to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Exec at the time. I remember when the target folder came through, and it was not the Chinese embassy that he approved bombing. I mean, it was some other target and they somehow, believe it or not, the community had failed to recognize that target had moved somewhere else and the Chinese embassy had moved in. The real problem was that our 3 cruise missiles precisely hit the ambassador's office, the attache's office, and the intelligence chief's office. That was what made our apology a little less convincing to them. But we actually sent someone to China and apologized. I believe it was a very high-ranking member of the Joint Staff. They didn't do that. I mean, they obfuscated, they lied, dissembled about that balloon, which clearly was a mistake. I mean, we have to think. And so this relationship's in a pretty fraught situation. I would lay the blame, the bulk of it, at Beijing's doorstep. I think wolf warrior diplomacy, economic coercion, physical confrontation resulting in dozens of Indian soldiers killed in a line of actual control in 3 separate incidents. Building islands in the South China Sea, promising not to militarize them and militarizing them. Again, the list goes on, and it's perplexing to me, if you think about get the big ideas right and all the rest of this, that 4th task, of refining the big ideas, there's a lack of awareness or recognition that this has been counterproductive unless you just truly want to be confrontational. And or, there are some domestic domestic reasons here, as President Xi has sought to consolidate power completely in the first 2 terms of his presidency to ensure that 3rd term. And now he does have control of the country, unlike that of any party leader since Mao. But this persists. And so again, I just find it very, very worrisome. We don't have the kinds of communication that existed even in the height of the Cold War or the depths of the Cold War. Even in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had communication going back and forth, as is very well documented, and enabled us to find a way out of that. And perhaps another element that adds to this complexity is, of course, that we're among each other's top trading partners. Folks throw out decoupling. We can't decouple. We can selectively decouple, and we are doing that. The executive order on the sale of the most advanced microchips, the IP in which they're based, and the machines that produce them, this is huge. And now, if you put yourself in China's shoes, there is some confrontational aspects to what it is that we're doing as well. But I am a bit concerned that this could, again, spiral somehow out of control from some small incident, and that you end up with some kind of very serious confrontation that would be very, very bad for our 2 countries and frankly for the world. So I think it's an increasingly serious situation. I know the folks in the White House and the community recognize this and are trying to figure out what's the appropriate policy response. But if you can't even communicate, remember the whole reason that Tony Blinken was going to Beijing was to establish guardrails on the relationship. Well, how's that working out? So this is a tough one. And it clearly, without question, this is why I mentioned that plate representing the U.S. and Western relation with China is the is not just the biggest in the tent, it's bigger than all the others put together. And of course, what we have to do is be absolutely certain that the elements of deterrence, and there's two of those, it's the potential adversary's perception of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to employ them on the other, that there's no questions in the potential adversary's minds about those. But we have a lot of work to do on the capability side. We have to truly transform our military and the other capabilities as well, because again, this is not just about the military. It's about diplomatic, it's about economic, it should be about trade. That's the big glaring absence in our comprehensive integrated policy, is that we walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a huge gap in this comprehensive approach. But that's the situation in which we find ourselves, and it is a very big deal. I can tell you, as the chairman of the Global Institute for the biggest investment firm in Asia of our type, the single biggest issue with which we are seized is constantly determining what can we do when it comes to investing in China, not just legally, but responsibly. What about Chinese investment with us? And then what about investment in all other countries that have exposure to China? Because it's no longer just about China. Let me end with just a very quick summary of the last decade's developments, because it's really important to have this context in mind as well. 10 years ago, about when I joined KKR, we were in an era that could be described as benign globalization, in which barriers to the movement of capital, investment, trade, economic, everything, they were all slowly going down, tariffs and so forth. Globalization, global trade is going like this. And essentially economics determine geopolitics. Geopolitical risk, which was what we were doing from the beginning, was something you did in the developing world, not in the major economies of North America, Europe, and the Pacific Rim. 10 years later, we're in an era of renewed great power rivalries, in which geopolitics very much constrains what you can do, increasingly constrains what you can do in investment, trade, economics, movement of capital goods, and so forth, in which globalization has become slowbalization. Global trade is still gradually going up, but much more slowly than it was. And in which, again, all the barriers are increasing rather than decreasing. This is a very, very dramatic shift. And what it means is that now global risk and geopolitical risk is present everywhere, because everybody touches China in some way. And of course, you have the dynamics involving Russia and Ukraine as well. So, I mean, a really interesting landscape out there. And frankly, a great time to be the chairman of the KKR Global Institute. You have real job security, I'm afraid.
Well, you know, sir, if I was a student sitting here, my takeaway would be Mandarin is a growth industry.
It may be, although, you know, even that, believe it or not, because, for example, I'm on the board of admissions of the Schwartzman Scholars Program. This is Steve Schwartzman, head of the other major private equity firm. Established this phenomenal college at Tsinghua University. It's intended to be the Rhodes Scholarship, but for the sort of the Far East, if you will. And our hopes for that, again, 8-9 years or so when you conceived it, when we did the first gathering and first vetting of students, I mean, we thought this is going to be fantastic. They're going to learn Mandarin. They're going to learn about China. There are Chinese students in the school and students from all around the world. And it's going to build bridges, and it's going to lower, you know, reduce doors, open door, whatever it is. All of this is going to happen. And instead, obviously, it's actually the opposite. So, yeah, I guess Mandarin is going to be important. And Russia's back, of course. Russia is also back. We're trying to find all those folks that we used to have during the Cold War. So let's open it up to
Russia's like my wardrobe. If you hold on to it long enough, it'll come back in style.
All those skinny ties are back in fashion.
They're coming back in style, sir. Let's open it up, sir.
Students.
Who wants to be first batter on deck?
Who's walking point? Okay, brave individual there. So the big idea, I think, about that kind of endeavor And we're actually practicing that big idea still in Iraq, northeastern Syria, Somalia, a couple other places. The idea is you have to get your commitment to a place that is sustainable. And sustainability is measured, there's two metrics for sustainability. It's blood and it's treasure. And I hate to say it's our blood and treasure. And the truth is that at the point where we withdrew, we hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months. It was not just because of this brilliant agreement with the Taliban, which I think was among the worst diplomatic deals we've ever made in our history. It was because we were no longer on the front lines appropriately. It was the Afghans who were fighting. And for all those that criticized the Afghans and said they wouldn't fight, 26 times as many Afghan soldiers died fighting for their country as did Americans. They would fight as long as they knew somebody had their back, like soldiers in any endeavor. And I felt we actually had a sustainable commitment. It wasn't ideal. It was frustrating. It was maddening. It was unsatisfactory. It was gradually eroding, but it was not unraveling completely. And actually, with a modest commitment of additional hardware, not soldiers, we could have probably stabilized that a bit and continued. Again, so we hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months, and the cost was, 25 billion, whatever, out of a defense budget of 800 billion or so at the time. That's really quite affordable. And I felt that that was, as frustrating and difficult as it was, that was preferable to what I feared would follow. And I did actually say that I feared a psychological collapse of the Afghan security forces when they realized that no one was coming to the rescue. Because keep in mind, we just didn't withdraw our 3,500 troops, which again was a very sustainable number, then followed all of the other coalition forces, which were much more numerous because they couldn't stay without us. Again, we're the person that has to keep all the plates spinning wherever we are. We also withdrew the 17,000 Western contractors who kept the aircraft functional that we had insisted on providing to them. In fact, when I was the commander in Afghanistan, I said, we will not buy Blackhawks. And I resisted, and we were still buying the Soviet era aircraft that they could maintain. They knew those from, again, their previous wars. But then Congress insisted that we buy American, and the bulk of their tactical helicopter fleet to get reinforcements, emergency resupply, medical evacuation, even door guns for some close air support. And then the other close air support aircraft were American, and they couldn't maintain them. They were far too sophisticated. And so when we withdrew those, the operational readiness of those plummeted. They're right in the middle of multiple fights around the country. And pretty quickly, the Afghans realized there's nobody coming to the rescue. They're watching their political leaders cut deals, and it all fell apart. So again, I just felt that was the previous situation was preferable to what I feared would follow. And sadly, I think that has been validated because the country is an absolute disaster. At least half the population is certainly way below the poverty line. They're basically starving, living from day to day. Half of that population, not mutually exclusive, is not allowed to go to high school or to college and can't do anything. The females can't do anything in society much anymore. And they're living under an 8th or 9th century interpretation of ultra-conservative Islam. So I think, again, a terrible outcome. I will say that one organization did brilliantly during the evacuation and the withdrawal, and it's the one that we were part of. And they got those individuals that worked with the CIA out. And it's a huge credit to the organization for the way it did that in the midst of what otherwise was a terribly chaotic withdrawal that left behind, conservatively, at least 150,000 individuals who qualified for the special immigrant visa and their family members. So it's, say 25,000 who qualified by serving a year or more on the ground with our forces as a battlefield interpreter, sharing risk and hardship, most of them many more than 1 year. And these are crucial individuals. Congress recognized that, authorized this special immigrant visa, and we've gotten very few of them out since the withdrawal, which left that as many as 150. Maybe I'm part of no one left behind as well. And again, we think it's probably 165,000. So that was not only did the result turn out disastrous, but I think it undermined deterrence for us around the world. Remember when we had a red line in Syria that turned out not to be a red line? And I remember meeting with the Prime Minister of Singapore at the time. I was out of government, and he said, you know, General, what happens there doesn't stay there. It reverberates around the world, and that you have to keep that in mind as you assess your posture in the Indo-Pacific region. So again, thankfully, I think that the administration has done a magnificent job, by and large, with some exceptions, as I mentioned. And frankly, we have achieved a sustained commitment in Iraq, in northeastern Syria, where we're staying, despite that tragic incident the other day in which a contractor was killed and a number of soldiers were wounded. But even in Somalia, and we've gradually increased our numbers in Somalia very modestly, but we're doing it in a way that is, again, sustainable. And there's a number of other commitments around the world in which we are practicing that big idea, which I thought was possible in Afghanistan. But thanks for the question. Please.
Sir.
Sir, thank you very much. Given your experience and your current responsibilities, how do you, sorry, hello? Okay.
I can hear you.
Your current responsibilities. How do you see the narrative that's out there, maybe popular, that China is positioned to surpass the United States economically and potentially militarily?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think it remains very much to be seen. Right now, China is entering a demographic downturn that's going to become a death spiral. What President Xi has done is to pull China to the Marxist and Leninist left in terms of economics and politics, if you will, and to the nationalist right in terms of its foreign policy. That's actually not good. Again, 8 years or so ago, the expectation that we had was that the state-owned enterprises would be drawn down. They were being drawn down. Again, they're just not as efficient and productive as, again, competitive organizations. And again, keep in mind, they still have hyper-competitive sectors in the Chinese economy. And you can see that. I've been to the Alibaba campus. I know Jack Ma. I've been to Xiaomi. These are extraordinary places. I will tell you one time, though, that I was in Beijing and it was a big dinner and there was actually a central committee member. So not a Politburo, but one of the top 20, but he was retiring. And I mentioned that I'd been at Hangzhou at Jack Ma's campus, and then I was hugely impressed. Again, this is a happier period, a more hopeful period, 8 years or so ago. And that individual pulled me aside later and he said, General, you should just keep in mind that President Xi could shut down Jack Ma with a single phone call. And I thought nothing about it until about 3 years ago when that actually happened, although I don't even know that it took a single phone call. Now Jack Ma has reappeared. Alibaba now is going to be broken into 5 or 6 different entities. It's going to be fascinating to see how that goes. Look, they are embarked on hugely impressive research. They're way beyond us in certain areas of infrastructure, high-speed rail. You name it. They have invested massively in some areas that actually provides them great advantages, and we need to catch up. And the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act is intended in part to help us do that, especially in areas like chips and others. And there is selective decoupling going on, again, to retard or to slow their progress in certain areas and make sure they don't get the fruits of our research in biotechnology, quantum computing, AI, machine learning, advanced weapons capabilities, and so forth. But again, they are a peer competitor, and you'd have to sort of walk your way across the various areas, the disciplines and areas of technology. They're ahead in some of these. Graham Allison at Harvard, former head of the Belfer Center, does brilliant analysis on this, and I suggest that you look at what it is that he has done. He's also the one who wrote the book Destined for War, no question mark, Destined for War, can China and the United States escape the Thucydides trap, which refers to this Thucydides chronicle of the Peloponnesian Wars, where you have an established power, Sparta, U.S., rising power, Athens, China, and Thucydides writes, inevitably they went to war. Well, inevitably, we can't go to war, not in a nuclear age, and that's what we have to do. We have to prevent. But he's also then studied very intently all the developments that they have, and they're extraordinary what they've done. There's a wonderful YouTube video that shows them replacing the bridge over an 8 or 10 lane highway. I've been across it. It's in Beijing. In 72 hours, I think it is, or 48 hours or something like that. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And you need to watch it to believe it. So they have extraordinary capabilities. They've stolen some of us from us. There's a reason why their high-end fighter looks like the F-35. They stole the plans. But it's not a given. It is not preordained. It's not inevitable. And I think we get a vote. I'm happy to see us voting in certain respects in that regard. And if we can continue to move forward, I think that we can very much continue to stay ahead of them overall. The idea that they inevitably were going to pass us in GDP just doesn't look quite so inevitable anymore.
So we have time for one more.
Okay, sure.
Ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking this evening. My question is, you talked about how China's relationship changed over in the past 10 years. In your opinion, what would you say was the most pivotal point where it went from working together? Like, who made the first move in changing that relationship into something that could grow into adversarial?
I think there were numerous actions taken really by China. I think that we had in mind an idea that dated at least to the Clinton administration, perhaps even farther, but certainly the Clinton administration, where, if we help China into the World Trade Organization, and they give them access to our economy, even though they didn't meet the criteria, by the way. So, I mean, we leaned on the WTO, we controlled it, sort of, and enabled them to join it, opened our economy to them. Now, of course, they're opening their economy to us, and they're 1.4 billion people now. So that's pretty attractive as well. But we saw this as hugely mutually beneficial. And we had this idea in mind that as they got more wealthy, as they pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, that inevitably they would become more open, more transparent, and more like us. Now, this is perhaps a little bit self-centered in our view, given we assume that us is. And keep in mind, by the way, remember that great article, The End of History, Francis Fukuyama, back, just 6 months before the wall came down, how incredible this was in his little journal, The National Interest, and he gets a book deal out of it and everything else. But, he predicts that the Soviet Union is going to collapse of its own weight, of its political and economic system, and that, again, history is over. His history and his definition was the sort of the dialectic or the competition between, again, democracy and free market capitalism, and again, this Communist Party political system and a command economy. And he predicted correctly that this is going to collapse and ours is going to ascend. And that's the end of history, because this is the ultimate, this is the paradigm, the pinnacle. It turns out that, there's some other views out there, and they're not entirely without some merit. And what the Chinese have done is extraordinary. But then along the way, all of a sudden, they started getting a bit more nefarious. They started stealing our intellectual property on a massive scale. They imposed the Great Firewall of China. They excluded by their practices our most successful, the biggest IT service providers in the world, in search engines and so forth. And it just continued to grow. I was in the Obama administration when, the islands were being built, and there were assurances given, we're going to stop that. Well, they didn't. Then there were assurances given that they would not militarize them. Well, that didn't turn out the way it was intended. And, there was even a promise, we'll stop stealing your intellectual property. And actually, the PLA did stop stealing our intellectual property, People's Liberation Army, their NSA version. And the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, started stealing it. So again, now again, maybe it's because this is a bit of a US-centric view and we're the good guys. But it seemed to me that we gave them every opportunity to prove that they were not nefarious, and they have missed every opportunity. And then, carried out really, again, the economic coercion against Australia, for example, is completely counterproductive. I was just in Australia a couple of weeks ago, and I mean, I heard this again in all three, Sydney, Melbourne, and Canberra. What they've done to India, which they're a fellow member of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and yet their soldiers beat up the Indian soldiers on the line of actual control, not once, but 3 times now, and have killed dozens of them, pushed Prime Minister Modi in an ultra-nationalist party and country, if you will, in a campaign season. He had to take actions that he did, and I'm not sure that they can recover from that. And yet they should have been trying to woo India away from us and away from the Quad being India, Australia, Japan, and the US, and again, firmly into the BRICS. And because India wanted the relationship with them. And, again, China's the biggest trading partner for 85 or 90 countries of the world. So I tend to think, again, that it has been a series of actions that then culminate really a couple of years into the Trump administration, where the conversation in Washington changes. And it's not just Trump and the Republicans, it's Democrats. And now you're at a situation where each party is competing with the other to be harder on China. And you have a special select committee on China, headed, by the way, by a former Marine. Mike Gallagher worked for me along the way. And so that's the situation at which we have arrived. And I think Beijing could actually back off this, but I don't see any inclination that that's going to happen. So it's a tough situation that you're going into with the great education that you're receiving here at the Bush School.
Well, sir, we can't thank you enough for this time. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on where you sit, class starts at 6:30 for a number of these students. So I don't want to get in trouble with the faculty, but Greg, you want to close out?
Yes, sir. I just want to remind you, sir, that I'm in Texas now. So if you need me, I can find a pickup truck with a heavy machine gun.
But do you have the baseball cap?
Sir, I can find one, believe me. Thank you so much.
No,
sir.
the
As
privilege
always,
is mine.
it's an honor.
I'm here for you.
It's always
Thank
an
you.
honor, sir. Thank you.
Privilege. Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks a lot, Cal.
Eagle 6, you're the man.
You're the man. Thank you. Great.
Thank you. Thank you for coming this evening.
Study hard.